Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line, including some significant ones. The Russians managed to recapture the northern part of the Ukrainian Belgorod incursion, leaving only 6 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control further south among the first patches. The Russians also managed to advance both within the Kharkiv region as well as the Luhansk and Donetsk region along the Serbets river line. They also managed to make advances within Chasiv Yar in the northern and central parts of Toretsk, in the area between Toretsk and the intersection east of Pokrovsk, and near the intersection east of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of the town of Mikhailivka and Myrolyubivka, the outskirts of the town, moving up in a northern direction towards Mykolaiivka and the road connecting to the east, where the Russians will be looking to encircle the Ukrainian fortified positions, as well as the remaining parts of the town of Yelisavetivka here further south. The Russians also managed to gain control over some fortified positions north of Melinivka and further residential areas in the western parts of the town, where they're looking to gain control over the outskirts of the town, reach into Mirne, gain control over Mirne as well as fight over the fortified positions to the north of Melinivka, gaining full control over all of these fortified positions, and then finally moving down south to encircle the Ukrainian fortified positions south of the town. The Russians also managed to advance here west of Novolenivka, gaining full control over the highway from the intersection all the way up to the northwest of the town, as fighting over the fortified positions and the first lines continue here west of the town, where they managed to gain control over the fortified position here. The Russians also managed to make a breakthrough here west of Zorya, where they managed to gain control over several fortified positions along the road, reaching the outskirts of the town. The Russians are now fighting over the forest lines in the area as well as the fortified positions within the near drop-off positions. This geolocated footage confirms this Russian breakthrough. The Russian forces managed to drive through the Ukrainian fortified positions using motorcycles, but managed to drop off infantry at the very outskirts. The Russians drove into a wedge that was likely built as an anti-tank ditch by the Ukrainians in the area, from which they lost their motorcycle and had to continue on foot. The Ukrainians then attempted to strike them with FPV drones, which they were trying to dodge. They laid on their back, shot their weapons in the air. In the end, it's unclear what the conclusion was, but there was footage of them entering some of these trenches in the nearby vicinity. So the Russians did gain control over the area, and it's likely that these advances were followed up by additional advances because the initial hurdle has been cleared, the Ukrainian forces have been cleared from these positions, and the Russians are now taking up these positions, which will allow them to develop offensive operations both in the direction of Nativka to the south, Zorya to the north, and widen their supply line by capturing the forest lines and fortified positions on the flanks. The Russians made several advances north of Toretsk, where they managed to gain control over fortified positions to the north of the city. The Russians also managed to clear the remaining residential area here south of Dashna, as well as the railway connection all the way up to Deliivka, where the Russians were also geolocated along the first line here south of Deliivka. With this, the Ukrainians have been completely cleared from this pocket. The Russians also managed to gain control over this fortified position here, based on which we can see that the Russians have now secured the northern flank of Toretsk. They remain to gain control over the remaining parts of the first patch area, Deliivka, and some fortified positions in the area. But with this, we can see that the Russians have started the push towards the fortified positions, gain control of which will mean that if the Russians move back to the industrial area and regain control over the residential area and the fortified positions on the western outskirts of the city, then the Ukrainian forces along the waste heaps and the northern residential area of Toretsk would be completely encircled, and they are currently operationally encircled, with the only supply line being along the main highway, which eventually is cut off by the Russian positions along the waste heap in the western parts of the city and the main highway area. So with this, the Ukrainian forces are now operationally encircled north of Toretsk and risk complete encirclement if the Russians move to gain control over the fortified positions and residential area in the northern parts of the city. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians managed to gain control of the remaining parts of the apartment complex area. With this, it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over the city. Chasiv Yar includes the residential area in the southern outskirts all the way towards Stupushki. This is why this video is entitled Chasiv Yar has fallen. Although that is the case with the capture of the apartment complex area, the Ukrainians will now be unable to recapture Chasiv Yar, and the Russians now have an opportunity to concentrate larger forces within the city under the cover of the apartment complex buildings. This allows them to launch a larger scale operations beyond that of the central parts. It also means that the forces sieging the apartment complex areas are now freed up. The Russians will now expand both north and south of Chasiv Yar to gain control over the remaining parts of the city, the fortified positions around it, and the towns closer towards Konstantinivka, to reach not the outskirts of the city, but gain control over these towns along the railway area to get within close proximity that FPV drones and artillery can strike Konstantinivka and its supply line in and out of the city. Further north along the Serebets river line, there are several developments in favor of the Russians. The Russians managed to re-enter Toretsk, where they managed to gain control over some fortified positions in the northern parts of the town and the residential area all the way to the central parts of it. The Russians appeared in the central parts of the town along the church area and the crossing which across the Serebets river line. They also managed to make a push towards the rear of these fortified positions, and then fighting is currently taking place in this entire area. It is unclear who controls what in it. The Russians may have full control of it, the Ukrainians may have managed to recapture some positions, it is unclear, but the Russians managed to gain control over a large portion of the residential area in the eastern parts of Toretsk. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining forest lines here to the east of Zelena Dolina, which will allow the Russians to start pushing towards the town itself, gaining control over which will allow them to expand their zone of control along the main road all the way to the rear of Koledyasi, because they have managed to secure the forest lines to the east of the road. With this, the Russians will be focusing on the western parts of it. The Russians also advanced here west of Makiivka along the main road, gaining control over several forest lines and forest patches as they are now within the outskirts of Rekivka. They are about to enter the town from the eastern direction. The Russians will be fighting over the final town remaining under Ukrainian control. There's one that is contested, the town of Tvetli-Hobova. However, Rekivka remains completely under Ukrainian control as the final town within the Luhansk region. Just north of this, the Russians also managed to gain control over additional forest lines in the direction of Zeleny High, reaching the outskirts of this town, which will allow them to fight over the additional positions here along the fortified positions and closer towards Borova as they continue offensive operations to secure the towns of Stepi and Kupenki by securing the western flank of these positions, creating a buffer zone between the road, which the Russians are looking to connect between the north and the south. If Russians connect this road and have a buffer zone around it, they're able to supply and connect their forces between the northern and southern flanks of the western bank of the Serbis river line for offensive operations in the direction of Borova itself, as well as the Usk river line in general. Finally, the Russians managed to regain control over the forest patches here south of Popovka, gaining full control over the border area here in the northern part of the Ukrainian Belgorod incursion. There's still the Ukrainian positions along the forest patches and forest lines here near Prilese and Grafovka. However, the northern parts has been completely recaptured by the Russian forces, as well as the town of Marina being captured across the border area into the Sumy region. Based on this, we can see that the Russians continued offensive operations all across the eastern section of the front line, from the southern parts of the Donetsk region to the very northern parts of it. At the same time, it is reported that the Russian units have started operating within the Dnipropetrovsk region, although there's no offensive in that direction yet. Some infantry groups are starting to operate across the border area. According to the reports, it's on a large scale that these DRGs are operating within the Dnipropetrovsk direction. This could mean several squads have crossed over the border area to put up some positions, potentially launch FPV strikes on Ukrainian supply trucks, ambushes, or simply do reconnaissance with drones or on foot to prepare for further offensive operations across the border area in the near future. We see based on the recent developments that the Russians are moving exactly as predicted along the fortified positions towards sieging the city of Kościancinivka here from the east, and this is getting closer and closer with the capture of the apartment complex area within Chasiv Yar. The movement will start in the northern flank of Kościancinivka, while the Russians are securing the city of Toretsk. The movement will develop in the eastern parts, and the movement is already developing in the southwestern parts of Kościancinivka, which means it is likely that Kościancinivka will be the first to be operationally encircled of the two cities of Kościancinivka and Pokrovsk. While in the Pokrovsk direction, there's been a lot of development since the start of this month. They are currently not moving towards the direct encirclement of the city yet. Of course, the movement east of Pokrovsk will develop towards cutting off the eastern road and starting attacks on that supply route. The Russians will also be needing to move on the western flank, but to do so, the Russians need to widen the front line, and to do so, they need to gain control over the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, at the very least up to Odradne in the southwest, and then move into the Dnipropetrovsk region, which they are currently preparing for. Based on this, we can see that the Russians will continue defensive operations towards the operational encirclement of Pokrovsk and Kościancinivka as expected. Over the past 24 hours, the Russians captured 27.5 square kilometers net gains, and with this, we can see that the Russians are continuing at a pace to which they will reach the operational encirclement of both Pokrovsk and Kościancinivka by the month of July. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.